Joe, no. You don't get to do that. There's so much about this Chad Daybell case that is upsetting. I didn't expect Joe Murray to be on my bingo card for things that would piss me off. But here we are. We finished his testimony, learned a whole lot about him. And then we've had another day of some more lighthearted things, so we'll hopefully end on that so I can not be pissed off for the rest of the day. Welcome to True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. I am your host, Annette Lyon, USA Today bestselling author of the suspense novel Just One More and a whole lot of other books, as well as a woman of faith. I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Unfortunately, what Chad and Lori purport to believe in, nope. And also a true crime junkie. And the collision of religion and true crime is what we're here for, and I'm adding context and clarity. Joe Murray, he took the stand on the first day of the defense's case in chief after his wife, Emma Daybell Murray, testified. Look at my last video about that. She's not a fan of Emma. And then her brother Garth testified. Joe got on the stand briefly at the end of the day, but we didn't hear too much from him. So I thought I would just talk about his testimony all on the same time. So that's what we're doing, beginning the front part of this video. And yeah, he didn't seem much of anything the beginning of his testimony on the other day. Kind of, milquetoast. He's how he learned about the shooting with Tammy and some clarifications there, which I appreciate that we learned on Tuesday, the 21st, which was day 27, about how he learned about the attempted shooting, which he still thinks was a paintball gun. No, because apparently Tammy posted to Facebook immediately, and then he went inside and Tammy had called Emma it was on speakerphone. So that clarifies some of my questions I had before. They're still insisting that the truck was Chad's, even though when Emma posted a little tribute to her mother after she died, it mentioned how even the day before she died, she loaned her truck to my husband. And now they're contradicting that, saying that the truck was considered Chad's. That was actually a nice catch by Nate Eaton at East Idaho News, by the way. Love that. Joe doesn't seem to have emotion, except for disdain for law enforcement. So that was real classy. Some of Joe's memory or testimony conflicts a little bit with Deputy Coulter Cannon's report about the incident with the attempted shooting. And Wixom said, well, is it possible that Deputy Cannon misheard you? And Joe said, no. I was very clear. And Wixom then clarified, are you saying that he lied on his report? And Joe said, yes. Deputy Cannon will be called back as a rebuttal witness when the defense rests their case. So I'm looking forward to that. But then Wixom then said, is it possible, asking about the whole, is it really a paint gun or an assault weapon? Is it possible that you could have misheard what Tammy said on the phone? And he says, no, it was on speakerphone. I heard very clearly. There's this level of arrogance that just rubs me the wrong way. Joe was not pleased that Lieutenant Hermosillo drove past their house on more than one occasion, now that they moved into Chad's house after he was arrested, and they felt that that was intimidating behavior or something along those lines. And Wixom said, well, I'll just play part of the video here. Let Joe speak for himself on this one, because essentially, long story short, the dude's a schmuck.
To drive back and forth by this property that they may have suspected the bodies were, and in fact found the bodies there. That wouldn't necessarily be unusual, would it?
Perhaps no. However, this was even after the bodies were taken out, that he would slowly drive by the property.
And to that point, so you would disagree that a detective who discovers bodies on a property, arrests somebody from the property, might have a surveillance or investigative interest in continuing to drive by the property. to identify if someone else was coming back to the property after the bodies had been removed. You don't disagree with that, do you?
I don't see the reason for it.
You're not a law enforcement officer, are you?
Absolutely not. I would rather choose any other profession.
Okay.
Choose any other profession.
But you don't disagree that a law enforcement officer who found bodies on the property might want to continue to observe that property to see if anything else suspicious occurred there at the property.
I don't see the reason for him returning.
When Detective Hermosillo was driving by the property, did he ever make contact with you?
No.
Were you aware that some kind of memorial had been placed on that property relative to Tylee and JJ?
Yes, but the slow driving by wasn't just on 200 North. It was also on Salem Highway.
You don't disagree that for a law enforcement officer to find 2 children buried on a property would be a traumatic event, do you?
I don't disagree. However, I don't understand why during working hours we would need to return and visit the memorial.
That says worlds of who Joe Murray is. I can't even. We are not talking about the officers responsible for the death of George Floyd. We are not talking about anything like that. We are talking about police officers who have been searching for missing children who wind up murdered and buried in horrific situations, circumstances. And Joe's own father-in-law arrested. And all he can do is say the last job he would ever take is to be a police officer, and have absolutely no compassion, no empathy for the trauma that police officers deal with day in and day out. That perhaps Hermosillo was doing his job. Perhaps sometimes when he drove past, he wanted to see the memorial that had been put up in honor of Tylee and JJ. So this just makes me just think back to Emma and her sticking her tongue out. Go watch the other video, the last one for that. Classy. Oh, you guys are just so classy. I have law enforcement background in my family and deep respect for the men and women who put their lives on the line. Here I get emotional again. Don't do that terribly often. I try to keep things relatively light. I was relieved when my family member retired after more than 20 years. And I have a deep respect for the work they did. Anyway, Joe, no. You don't get to do that. And, on a lighter note, I wanted to say you said this in a room with law enforcement. There's the bailiff and security guards, and I believe Hermosillo was in the room. There's a time to read the room, Joe. As much as I now despise Joe Murray, thank you, Pryor, for putting him on the stand, because that's not helping Chad's case. It's just making everyone around Chad look like a heartless jerk. So thanks. Thank you, Pryor. Thank you for doing that, showing us who he is. I will point out that on Wednesday the 22nd, Joe's brother Dawson, his little brother, was in court, and he talked to Nate Eaton as well as Lauren Mathias from East Idaho News and Hidden True Crime, respectively. And he has made it clear that their family does not just unilaterally support Joe. He's not speaking for the entire family, but he says he is not the only one who believes that Chad is guilty, and he wants justice for those who have lost their lives. So, thank you, Dawson. He is one of 12 children, apparently. He is the younger brother of Joe. He said there are 2 siblings between him and Joe. After Joe, we had a forensic pathologist take the stand, Dr. Kathy Raven. that was called. Again, we're on the defense's case in chief. So she reviewed the autopsy of Tammy Daybell and was giving her opinion. She went through, said that there is no anatomical reason for her death. There is no toxicological reason for her death. However, since there's no scientific clear proof of what killed her, like say a gunshot wound or something like that, then she believes it should be listed as undetermined rather than homicide. And the best practices would be not to let confirmation bias sway. And part of me wanted to say, okay, well, confirmation bias is what helped us avoid the autopsy to begin with. Now we have an autopsy and a whole lot of suspicious circumstances. But what really there were a couple moments with her testimony that very much cracked me up. One was that Pryor talking about, he kept calling it confirmatory bias. And she said, "You mean confirmation bias?" And yes, confirmatory bias. I knew he was trying to get at the 5 different manners of death that medical examiners can use, or forensic pathologists describing natural, accident, homicide, suicide, or undetermined. Those are the 5 manners of death. And I knew that's where he was going. He was like, so when you make a determination, blah, blah, blah. And she was like, well, yeah, there's differences of things. And he says, well, but the 5 different, and finally she goes, you mean the manners? And he's like, yeah, that thing. The prosecution, with their own witnesses and in their case in chief, had brought up the possibility that a weight had been on Tammy's chest to prevent her from breathing. Say a person could have been pushing or sitting on them and on her chest, and that wouldn't leave a mark to lead toward asphyxia. So what are the possibilities of that? And she said, well, it's possible, but unlikely. It would probably take, she cited some study saying it would take at least 450 pounds of pressure. So she says it's unlikely unless there's more than one person. And we're thinking, well, prosecution thinks there is, that there were 2, Chad and Alex. She says, so if there's more than one person, so check, or if the victim was weak or ill or old. And I laugh because Pryor has been trying to say that Tammy was weak and ill. Not old, but weak and ill. So that didn't help his argument that she could not have died of asphyxia. Good job, Pryor. Good job. When, again, going to the whole confirmation bias thing, a lot of people got this, and I laughed. But I have one part of this that nobody else has mentioned, and this is where the English major geek word nerd person comes in, child of a linguist thing. There are actually 2 words that were relevant and not just one on this one. So I'll play this quick video.
Is that an example of confirmation bias when you take into account all of these other reports, documents, statements of people who were not present at the murder?
So, and it's a difficult question.
Well, Schadenfreude is real. It's a beautiful thing sometimes, He says, present at the murder. In the process of arguing that Tammy Daybell died of natural causes, he refers to her death as the murder. I don't know if the jury caught that. A little bit of a slip of the tongue. Freudian slip, whatever you want to call it. But here is why I have seen Nate Eaton, at least, and I imagine others, have proposed that you could argue he was just referring to suspicious deaths or murders in general, like a global situation. Like if someone says, when you do this, that, and the other, and they're not meaning you, they just mean a person. So it could be referring to like any murder. Here's why I think no. I think it was a real slip. In English, we have 2 very distinctive articles that we use to distinguish between whether we mean a general thing or whether we mean something very specific. If I say a table, I'm just referring to some generic, general table. It could be, if I go to buy a table and I'm not referring to a specific one, it's just a table. But if I say the table, I'm referring to a specific one, whether it's I'm pointing to the one in my parents' dining room or my kitchen or wherever. If I say the table, it's implied that we know that I am referring to a specific one. So he did not say for people present at a murder. He said the murder, which means we're referring to a specific one. Which one? Tammy's. I think he slipped on that one and admitted that Tammy was indeed murdered. So I hope, even if the jury didn't recognize it consciously, on some level, it's sinking. I hope. A beautiful moment on cross with Dr. Raven was Lindsay Blake. She's fantastic, and I just adore her. The entire prosecution team is fabulous, but this particular moment was just chef's kiss. So on cross, she gets up and she starts reading a list of reports and interviews. First she says, well, what files and reports did you use to make your determination about, your opinion on Tammy Daybell's autopsy? And then she lists, the coroner's report and then the medical examiner's final report of the death certificate. And she lists various things that you would expect. And then Lindsay Blake starts listing a whole bunch of other stuff. She says, did you read a report about this? Did you read this report by this person? Did you read this? Did you go over this? Did you review this? And she goes on and on. Eventually, Pryor objects, which I am sure she expected. It took him a while. This was literally minutes into her reading this list. So I'm not showing the whole thing because her list was literally 7 minutes long altogether. But this is about, several minutes into her list of reports and when Pryor finally made his objection and what happened next.
Did you review a report of an interview with Matthew and Regan Price?
I don't believe so.
Did you review a report of an interview with Haley Palmer?
No.
Did you review any reports of interviews with Angela Yancey?
No.
Did you review a report of an interview with Ronald and Phyllis Douglas?
Judge, I'm going to object at this point to the relevance of how that would have an impact on the autopsy. She's going to go down a list of every report that any witness in this case discussed.
No speaking objections, please, but I'll...
So I will say that cracked me up that it took him that long to object. But then when he did object, he didn't do the typical objection relevance or objection hearsay, objection speculation, objection. Usually you label it, but instead he just goes on with this, what Judge Boyd says, no speaking objections. However, the judge upholds it for a moment until Lindsay Blake can explain.
sustain the objection at this point unless there's some specific relevance to the autopsy.
Specific relevance to the autopsy.
And if I may respond?
Go ahead.
I'm reading off a list that was reviewed by the Utah medical examiners in making their findings.
Okay.
I think it
These are a list of things that the Utah medical examiner used when determining in Tammy's autopsy her cause of death. It is directly related to her autopsy.
is relevant.
All right. If that's the foundation for that, I'll allow that to continue. Thank you, Ms. Blake.
Did you review a report of an interview with Ronald and Phyllis Douglas?
No.
And from that point on, poor Dr. Raven's voice was like, oh, she sounded so defeated. You are a brilliant person, Lindsay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Pryor didn't give her those things, which then I'm hoping the jury noticed that right there. It's confirmation bias. If he is not giving his expert witness all of the files and information that she might need, only the ones he thinks are relevant to lead to his conclusion, that is confirmation bias, my friends. After Dr. Raven, we had Regan Price, who is a neighbor of the Daybells. She lived just across the street from the Daybells. This is the intersection where the Daybell house is. So I don't know if you can see the white there is the the Daybell property, and then to the southwest is Emma's house. Emma and Joe live there, and then directly down from the Daybells and to the right of Emma, that is where Regan Price lived, and her husband. So Regan goes up to testify, and I'm not entirely sure why Pryor thought that was a good idea. It didn't really offer much of anything. She reported hearing a gunshot, and she wasn't even sure what day it was or anything like that. But she thought perhaps it was relevant when she heard there were missing children, so she reported it. And on the stand, she said, yes, actually, gunshots are not uncommon to hear in their area of Idaho. It could have well been some other neighbor. It could have been an innocent explanation. I also wonder if Chad did discharge a firearm, either to try to uphold his story or perhaps to do something to Tylee's body. We think she was already dead at that point, but I wouldn't put it past Chad to do more heinous things. Please give us a like and a follow and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single video. It really helps with the algorithm, helps people find us as we grow. We appreciate it. And we had an investigator from the Idaho Attorney General's office. His testimony was interesting. He talked briefly about when he was interviewing Melanie Gibb, and she was telling him about the whole light and dark beliefs, went into a lot of her beliefs. Pryor was trying to make it sound like this was only hers and that she did not get the stuff from Chad. That didn't really fly. It sounded like it was very clear that they all believed these things, and perhaps even that Chad had taught her some of it. Wasn't really damning either direction. But if anyone's wondering what this man's name was, I will play his own voice because only Judge Boyce came close to pronouncing it correctly. But here's how he says it.
Investigator, would you state your name and spell your last name for the record for me, please?
Asmir Kararic, Kararic.
All right.
The C at the end is throws you off because it doesn't sound like that would be a cha sound, and he emphasized the middle syllable. So Kararic is. I'm probably not doing a great job. Basically ended saying that he turned off the interview recorder, and then he asked one final question, kind of like, well, hey, Melanie Gibb, since you do this whole light and dark thing, what would you rate me? And she said, oh, you're very light. There's an aura about you. It wasn't on tape because the interview had officially ended and he didn't expect anything new to come, but he did report that later. Note, however, Melanie did not give him a number. She did not say you were 3.4 light or anything like that. That's what Chad does. But she thought you're light and you have an aura, which is pretty dang innocent compared to what Chad was doing, and Lori. Rexburg police detective Rick Schmidt, and he was on very briefly again. I don't know why Pryor thought this was a good idea. This was his attempt again to try to make it look like law enforcement is doing a shoddy job. Detective Schmidt was on the ground and present during the June 2020 warrant where they found the children's bodies. And when he got there, essentially the testimony was that he was given a shovel and he was told to walk around the property with at least one other person and look for soft spots and suspicious spots of the ground where something might have been disturbed. But then it was, whoa, well, did you notice a grid system or boundaries, or were you just told to dig anywhere? And so, yeah, Pryor was trying to make it sound nefarious, and it kind of, the prosecution on cross pretty much was like, this is a nothing burger again. Then we get to day 28. This is where hopefully I can laugh some more rather than just being pissed off at Joe Murray. I'm still mad. Was definitely a shorter day. It's also incredibly boring. I imagine sitting in that courtroom would have been very trying and tiring, and just because it was so dry. They had Metadata Forensics, that's a company, CEO Patrick Eller on the stand, and they went through a lot of things like explaining what a geofence is, which we've already done with the FBI agents who over this stuff already. We went through a lot of those same kinds of explanations. Ironically, Pryor still does not understand how much of this works. This one goes to show how Pryor just cannot understand a lot of technology, and it's just, we're not talking super advanced technology either. Let's listen to him.
What if I have Verizon and another phone has Apple or T-Mobile? Does that change whether you can access it through Google?
It does not change. It just changed what they would store because it depends on what you're using on the device itself. So AT&T.
Mr. Eller did a great job of not laughing. Here's another little lovely one of this to show you just how boring some of this got.
But there were how many, if you could count for me in the green, that they decided for further inquiry?
There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you were to remove the numbers that are more than 10, you would see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, excuse me. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Those poor jurors. Those poor jurors. That's all I can say. I cannot even imagine trying to stay awake. And I cut out some of Pryor going, because, you know, that's even more boring, and I'll spare you. Our last hilarious moment from our delightful Mr. Pryor here. Again, just showing how boring the morning of the 22nd was.
Can you testify about some of the conclusions you drew from listening to their testimony?
So, well,
Objection, that's overly broad.
Let's talk about their location data in terms of their geofence testimony about Alex Cox's phone on, let's say, September 9th.
okay.
Go ahead.
What would you like to know about it?
Well, I'd like to know what you took an opportunity to examine the geofence evidence from September 9th and listen to the testimony of Officer Stubbs. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Did you find anything of interest in terms of his testimony that caused you to conduct further review?
Yes. So in listening to the testimony,
He finally has a question he can answer. Like, yeah, well, what do you want to know? Absolute silence. And I love that Rob Wood had to go in and go, that's not actually a question. That's too broad. You gotta find the fun where you can, because it gets heavy. The last witness of the day on the 22nd, because we had another early day. I think we're going through witnesses a whole lot faster than Pryor expected, because again, he doesn't have much to defend. Not much you can do. Dr. Gred Hempikian, I believe. He's a DNA expert. So we're like, oh, what's he going to do here? Essentially, he confirmed that all of the labs had conducted the tests appropriately and that their results were accurate. Okay. The biggest thing we heard from him was that sometimes the absence of evidence is evidence. So sometimes, you know, someone can say, well, this person's DNA should have been present at a specific crime scene, and because it's not, that's evidence of their innocence. So the implication being, because we didn't find Chad's hairs and DNA on, say, JJ's body, then he wasn't involved. That's a stretch. That is a huge stretch, especially because we know that Alex was his fall guy. We know with Chad's precious little soft hands that he doesn't do hard work himself. He was probably standing right there, handed Alex the shovel, or maybe he told Alex to go get the shovel even. Yeah, it's not suspicious that his DNA is not present. That was basically all that we got. Just like with Mr. Eller, the digital guy, and that was his conclusion. I didn't mention that before. Essentially, all he could come up with all his testimony, the really dry, boring stuff, was that we couldn't prove that Chad was ever at home on his property, ever. That's it. Because he was probably smart enough to turn his phone off, or if it was on, to have all location services from every app turned off. So we don't have data from Chad's phone. But to say that there's no data, therefore he was never at home, is a little ludicrous. Then there's also the fact on cross where they pointed out that during the time that Alex was clearly on the Daybell property, on the day that we know that JJ was buried, or Tylee was buried, that a minute after Alex left, that is when Chad sent the infamous raccoon text to Tammy saying that he had just shot a raccoon in their yard and buried it. And we don't have anything to clearly identify that he sent that text from his home either. But we can kind of infer that he was home when he sent that text. The digital testimony there did not do much. Dr. Grid Hempikian also, again, you have none of Chad's DNA, and they didn't test the garden tools. Well, they didn't test the garden tools for Chad's DNA because, of course, his DNA would be on his own property. That would be like saying, oh my goodness, Chad's DNA was on his pillow, on his own toothbrush. Like, of course, if he ever touched his own yard implements, of course his DNA and fingerprints would be there. That is not suspicious. But they didn't test for his DNA. That's why they didn't find it. And there were some DNA and some fingerprints on JJ's body that they could not conclusively identify. So there is a possibility that Chad's DNA was there. It just wasn't enough for a clear profile. And maybe some of his fingerprints, but they weren't clear enough. We don't know. But just that in this case, there's so much other evidence that I don't think that these witnesses did anything to help the defense case. There's just too much. And then Hempikian actually said, when it comes down to it, it's the jury's job to decide the weight of each piece of evidence and whether the lack of evidence as evidence it has weight. So, yeah. Yes, they do. It's up to the jury. It's their job. They get to do that. And I really doubt that they will see this as evidence or doubt of anything. Boyce dismissed court about 1:40 p.m., said that they would be doing some hearing things off the record, or at least away from the public and away from the jury. It sounded like scheduling things perhaps about sequestering the jury when the time comes. If it's a guilty verdict, then they would have to sequester for the deliberations on death penalty or life in prison. Surprise, about 2:48 p.m., the live stream came back on. We learned that they were discussing some of the rebuttal testimony and plans for that. The state said that their rebuttal was expected to take about 2 days, with narrow focused testimony on things that the defense had brought up in their case in chief. The state wants to recall Detective Hermosillo, and no surprise, Pryor objects to bringing him back. He says that there's no way he hasn't talked to people after his testimony. Yes, he's been deeply and very closely involved in the case. He knows it inside and out. I mentioned earlier they wanted to bring Deputy Coulter Cannon back. Pryor objected to that as well. On both counts, Boyce said, well, they're allowed to take the stand. We will ask them if they have talked to anybody. And if there are questions you want to object to, we will address that on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, they're allowed. It sounds like there was a question about Emma's testimony and one of her statements about the life insurance policies that she and her mother bought at work that one day, when she said that they did not consult their husbands. And apparently that was an issue because Judge Boyce had already ruled that Tammy's coworker Janice Olson had made a statement that was inadmissible, I believe as hearsay, and Emma's testimony is somehow connected with that. And I don't know if it sounds like it might have corroborated that testimony, but if it was already ruled inadmissible, then what do we do with Emma's testimony? So it sounds like she may be coming back during the rebuttal stage. We don't really know for sure, but we have a long weekend ahead of us with Memorial Day, so we will see. I suspect that the defense will rest their case by the weekend, if not sooner. I cannot imagine that we'll have the rebuttal before next week. I'm guessing it will begin on Tuesday after Memorial Day. I could be wrong. We're on Wednesday. If the defense decides to rest early Thursday morning, perhaps the state could do their rebuttal witnesses Thursday, Friday, and then the jury could have the case in their hands for the weekend. But I do suspect that the court is going to think, you know, the jury has already sacrificed 2 months of their lives, essentially. So let's let them have Memorial Day. That's my hope anyway. They have served long and hard, and I can't imagine the position they are in. That's my report of days 2 and 3 of the defense case in chief, which is day 27 and 28 of the trial itself, and that's not counting jury selection, which was like another, a week and a half or whatever. We're getting close, guys. We're getting close. So I'll be thinking about trying to have some compassion and empathy for those jurors. Also for people like Dawson Murray, who are good people that are traumatized by this whole situation. Unlike Joe and his wife Emma, who apparently don't have a heart or any decency. You know? I support our law enforcement. That's all there is to it. So here's my chocolate. Go get yours.